1962 was also the year Hobsbawm published his landmark work, The Age of Revolution, the first book in what would eventually become a series of 4, describing the making of the modern world.
The Age of Revolution covers the period from the French Revolution up to the 1848 revolutions in a way that reflects both his Marxist thinking. So, for example, there are sections in it on the falling rate of profit and capitalism and things like that. And there's a definite class interpretation. But he also has this influence of the French Annales school and the enormous breadth of the coverage of the book and the knowledge he portrays in it, the interpretations he gives of culture, literature, the arts, science.
So the structure of the Age of Revolution, of course, takes its foundation on 2 revolutions. On the French, which is a political one, in which the economic side is not terribly important. I mean, it is not a capitalist revolution, although Marxists in the past have tended to say, this is a bourgeoisie taking power. He says, no, it's not really the bourgeoisie taking power. It's an exponent of the professional middle classes taking power at a particular moment in French history. And similarly, the British Industrial Revolution is a bourgeois revolution where the bourgeoisie doesn't take power. It becomes powerful economically, but it does not produce a class which takes power. There's a sort of compromise in which the aristocracy says, well, if that's what you want, why not? You know, it makes the country more prosperous and bigger, you know, sort of it's fine.
One of the many strands Hobsbawm follows through the Age of Revolution is the emergence of nationalism and national identity. Nationalism, he writes, like so many other characteristics of the modern world, is the child of the dual revolution.
The growth of the countries, specifically Britain and France, was a growth in the power of a state. A growth in the power of a state must have some kind of ideological basis. It must unite the nation. It cannot be a class. It cannot be a region. It's got to be the whole country, which is the territorial entity upon which the state rules. And so the combination of a state must create a nation and therefore a nation state. And that is the origin of modern nationalism.
The examples of France and Britain inspired movements of young radical liberals across Europe to imagine their own national sovereignty. The young Italy of Mazzini, young Ireland, young Germany. But it was through the advance of mass education that their nationalist ideals really took hold.
The development of education is central, in Hobsbawm's view, to the construction of nationalism, because you need to figure out what is it that you're going to teach the kids in schools. And that is the business of a state. In most European countries, it is the state that controls what is being taught and the language in which it's going to be taught. So you have a solidification of a national language. And once you have the decision to have a centralized state education sector, the most important element in it is not the obvious stuff like maths, because 2 + 2 is 4 throughout the world. No, it's history. It's, well, the national literature is important, but history is the important one. Where do we come from? What is our history? And nearly all the invention of national history occur in the 19th century.
The Age of Revolution was the era in which the construction of national identities began, a process which was central to Hobsbawm's understanding of the 19th century.
nationalism is manufactured out of the past, and on the contrary, I mean, the past is the raw material for nationalism. And I'm bound to say that virtually everything that nationalists say about the past is wrong. As a famous 19th century French expert once put it, Ernest Renan, in his great lecture on what is nationalism, saying getting your history wrong, or indeed even forgetting history, is part of the element of becoming a nation, which is why nationalism is not compatible with the progress of history. Citizenship is more than a piece of paper, more than a passport. However, citizenship is something for all inhabitants of the territory. The danger in a nation-state which is based on ethnicity or something like that is that the inhabitants of that particular state, as it were, the state belongs to one of these groups, and the others are less important, as for instance in Slovakia. Slovakia is not a state of everybody that lives in Slovakia. It belongs to the Slovaks, and the others are, as it were, guests or tolerated, or, in this case, might be not tolerated. And that's, once again, where the trouble starts.
In 1975, Hobsbawm followed up his Age of Revolution with the Age of Capital, continuing the story of the modern world up to 1875. He writes, in the 1860s, a new word entered the economic and political vocabulary of the world: capitalism. The global triumph of capitalism is the major theme of history in the decades after 1848. And underpinning this triumph of capitalism was the further evolution of nationalism and the formation of nation-states.
So in the age of capital, you have the construction of capitalism as a wider system, and that requires nationalism as well. So Bismarck is not a nationalist to begin with, but my God, when it is necessary to use nationalism to unify Germany, or at least a part of Germany, he certainly uses it. And then in the United States, you have what would be the achievement of American nationalism, namely the Civil War. It's paradoxical to talk about the Civil War being an achievement of nationalism, but the Civil War was fought for a number of reasons. Freeing the slaves is one of them. But another way of looking at the Civil War was to establish the victory of the capitalist North, and therefore to be able to construct an American nationalism without a country deeply divided between two social systems, one based on slavery, but integrated in the world economy, and one much less integrated in the world economy, but capitalist, namely the ever-growing industrial North. And 1861, the emancipation of the serfs in Russia, when the Russian authorities realized that they were defeated in Crimea because they were not advanced. And one of the ways of being advanced was to become more capitalist. And one of the ways of becoming more capitalist was to free the serfs so they could become labor force. So you can see in Hobsbawm construct, ideologies play a role, but it's a subordinate role to other imperatives, which are not just economic in the sort of traditional Marxist way, classes and so on, but actually materialistic would be a better Marxist way of defining it.
By 1876, Germany, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia had all become independent sovereign states. But there was an inbuilt tension in these developments. National identity was largely a constructed artefact, dependent on the liberal institutions of the state to impose uniformity, most notably through an official language. Those who happened not to speak the official language were required either to assimilate or to accept an inferior position. Hobsbawm writes, the paradox of nationalism was that in forming its own nation, it automatically created a counter-nationalism. The age of liberalism did not grasp this paradox. A world of nations would, it was believed, be a liberal world, and the liberal world would consist of nations. In 1987, Hobsbawm followed up his Ages of Revolution and Capital with The Age of Empire. Together, the three books present an overview of what Hobsbawm called the long 19th century, with The Age of Empire taking the story up to 1914. As he writes, this book surveys the moment in history when it became clear that the society and civilization created by and for the Western liberal bourgeoisie represented not the permanent form of the modern industrial world, but only one phase in its early development.
There we get one of the basic contradictions of the liberal era, the liberal bourgeoisie. Liberalism and democracy in the 19th century were not the same things. We think of it as going together, like, you know, bacon and eggs. But bacon and eggs are not naturally connected either. So liberalism, on the contrary, worked best when democracy wasn't there, because how the devil could you rely on the ignorant and selfish and brutalized masses to understand the logic of what their betters were saying, particularly the economic logic? But at the same time, you see, the ideas of liberalism meant that sooner or later these things would have to be extended.
The expansion of the electorate brought an era of mass political awakening, both for the working class and the new socialist parties which represented them, and the lower middle class, the so-called little men, threatened by big property above and collectivism below. In this arena of democratized politics, nationalism became a potent political tool. The basis of nationalism of all kinds was the same, Hobsbawm writes: the readiness of people to identify themselves emotionally with their nation. The democratization of politics, and especially elections, provided ample opportunities for mobilizing them. When states did so, they called it patriotism, and the essence of the original right-wing nationalism which emerged in already established nation-states was to claim a monopoly of patriotism for the extreme political right, and thereby brand everyone else as some sort of traitor. By the early years of the 20th century, the economic rivalry between the European powers had expanded into imperial rivalry. The balance of power was becoming unmanageable.
People drew a parallel between political and military power and economic power. They thought that one has got to be proportionate to the other. So if the Germans rise, they think they've got to be not merely richer, but also more powerful and also, in a military sense, more dominant. And it is this, it seemed to me, this principle of proportionality which made it impossible to manage international relations as they had previously been managed, because there was no way in which you could actually negotiate permanent arrangements. And they tried to, but they couldn't.
The world Hobsbawm describes at the end of the Age of Empire is the one he was born into in 1917. But it wasn't until over 70 years later that Hobsbawm came to write about his own times. Age of Extremes, published in 1994, covers the period from 1914 to 1991, what Hobsbawm called the short 20th century. And he divides that century into three periods, the first of which he calls the Age of Catastrophe.
I think what we're talking about, what gives a unity, if you like, to the history of this period from 1914 until the present, is, in the first place, the breakdown of 19th century civilization. You can call it different things. You can call it bourgeois liberal, you can call it liberal capitalism, but at all events, that kind of civilization broke. And for 30-odd years, it was by no means clear that it would survive. 31 years of world total war, which the number of people killed, scattered, murdered, all the rest of it, runs into tens of millions. most appalling business, for instance, is the breakdown in war of the distinction between competence and non-competence, which was, after all, the core of civilized values. If you wanted to do anything to limit what is in essence a barbarous and inhuman activity, the one thing you had to do is to distinguish between people whose business it is to kill and get themselves killed and the innocent bystanders.
But this age of catastrophe gave way in the decades after 1945 to what Hobsbawm describes as the Golden Age.
And then for 25 years you get what is a mysterious but unquestionably extraordinary age, roughly the third quarter of the 20th century, in which all the problems which previously appeared to have existed disappeared, or that's what it looked like. Sometime around the middle of this century, 10,000 years of human history ended. The change, social, economic, technical change, accelerated at an incredible rate. For instance, until the middle of the 20th century, the great majority of the human race lived on the countryside and lived off various kinds of agriculture and livestock. This is no longer the case. And moreover, it's gone down at a rate which is unbelievable within the lifetime of people that aren't particularly old. And then it happens from the early 70s on, once again, if not a breakdown, but a slide into an uncertain future.
Hobsbawm calls the final decades of his short 20th century the landslide. He describes a period beginning with the oil crisis in 1973, during which, for much of the world, across Africa, South America and Western Asia, economic growth stopped and most people got poorer. While in the West, the foundations of the Golden Age were rapidly crumbling. The historic tragedy of the crisis decades, he writes, was that production now visibly shed human beings faster than the market economy generated new jobs for them. The trend for dividing the world into ever smaller nation-states continued, just as the globalized economy became increasingly dominated by powerful transnational corporations, which in turn increased the power and importance of supranational political bodies.
While in theory we now live in a world of free nation-states, in practice we live in what we can now recognize as a deeply unstable form of global disorder, both internationally and within states. A number, probably a growing number of these political entities appear incapable of carrying on the essential functions of territorial states, or they are threatened with disintegration by secessionist movements. What's more, since the end of the Cold War, we live in an era when uncontrollable or barely controllable armed conflict has become endemic in large areas of Asia, Africa, Europe, and parts of the Pacific. Massacre amounting to genocide, the mass expulsion of populations, for which we have invented the term ethnic cleansing, are once again taking place on a scale not seen since the aftermath of World War II. But no return to the old system is possible.
I believe that particularly the last 20, 30 years, which has been globalization under the sign of complete lack of control, free market, complete free market, has produced not only inequality, but also enormous instability. Rapid booms, dramatic slumps, and transformations of unpredicted and rapid. And this also has, it seems to me, creates even greater instability. Now, what makes me afraid is that the people who are likely to benefit from this instability politically are the reactionaries. Xenophobia, racism, economic and particularly religious fundamentalism, which is rising in all major religions. I fear that the cause of reason and progress and improvement, for which all of us stood in different ways, whether as liberals or socialists or communists or whatnot, is now being weakened. And that is what, in a sense, I look forward, therefore, if anything, to a political advance of the people who created enormous tragedies in the 20th century. It won't be fascism, but it would be the same sort of family of ultra right-wing nationalist or fundamentalist things. That is enough to be afraid of.